The wisdom of the disillusioned, literature of the first intermediate period, broken. Matt and the scrawl of despair, imagine being a scribe, or simply a literate person, in the first intermediate period. The world around you has shattered. The predictable order, Matt, once thought immutable, has dissolved into chaos. The pharaoh, once a living god guaranteeing cosmic balance, is now a distant, ineffective figure. If he exists at all in your fractured corner of Egypt, the very foundations of your society, a stable Nile, central governance, and an orderly afterlife have crumbled. In this crucible of despair, a new kind of literature emerged, a raw, poignant, and often deeply cynical reflection of a world turned upside down. This wasn't the triumphant prose of Old Kingdom monuments. It was the wisdom of the disillusioned, scrawled in a time of fading hope. For you, the common Egyptian, these writings, however few, were a mirror to your own suffering and a desperate attempt to find meaning in a world that had seemingly abandoned its divine compact. The Old Kingdom had produced a rich body of literature, primarily focused on hymns to gods and pharaohs, biographical texts celebrating the achievements of the elite, and administrative records. These texts upheld the prevailing ideology of a perfectly ordered cosmos, reflecting a sense of confidence and stability. They spoke of the pharaoh's benevolence, the abundance of the land, and the secure journey to an eternal afterlife. But with the onset of famine, civil war, and the collapse of centralized authority, this optimistic worldview was utterly shattered. The traditional scribal schools and institutions that produced and preserved these texts also suffered immensely. As discussed in Story 8, papyrus was scarce, and few could afford the luxury of literacy or the time for composition. Yet, despite the hardship, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. Individuals, often from the now dispersed intellectual elite or those clinging to their knowledge in the courts of powerful nomarchs, began to write. But what they wrote was fundamentally different. This new literature, often termed pessimistic literature, or lamentations, marked a stark departure from the celebratory tone of earlier periods. These were not works commissioned by the state to glorify a pharaoh, but often deeply personal reflections on suffering, injustice, and the breakdown of society. The central theme running through many of these texts was the profound questioning of Matt. If the cosmic order was perfect and divinely ordained, why was there such widespread suffering? Why were the poor starving while some still clung to wealth? Why were the traditional values of justice and righteousness being trampled underfoot? The writers expressed a sense of confusion and betrayal, a deep disillusionment with a world that no longer made sense. This was a direct echo of the experience of the common people, for whom the promise of order had clearly failed. One of the most powerful examples of this genre is the admonitions of Ipu. Imagine hearing this text, perhaps recited by a wandering storyteller or a disillusioned former scribe, its words echoing your own fears and observations. It vividly describes a world in utter chaos. The land spins round like a potter's wheel. The poor of the land have become the owners of riches, and he who had property has none. Behold, noble ladies are starving. Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The laws of the audience chamber are thrown out. People walk upon them in the streets. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was a brutally accurate depiction of the breakdown of social hierarchy, the rampant injustice, and the sheer suffering that you would have experienced daily. The traditional roles were inverted, the familiar order was gone, and violence was pervasive. Another significant text is the dispute between a man and his bar, his soul. This deeply introspective dialogue features a man contemplating suicide as an escape from the unbearable suffering and injustice of the world. His soul, or bar, tries to dissuade him, describing the grim realities of death and the unfulfilled promises of the afterlife. This text captures the profound despair and existential crisis of the era, the feeling that even death might offer no escape from a broken reality. It speaks to the inner turmoil of individuals like yourself, grappling with a life that offered little hope. These texts, often preserved on fragmentary papyri or later copied during more stable times, represent a courageous act of intellectual survival. They show that even when the physical structures of civilization crumbled, the human capacity for reflection, lamentation, and the search for meaning persisted. They were a raw, honest outpouring of grief and confusion, a testament to the fact that the Egyptian mind, though under immense duress, refused to be silenced. What insights would these profound, sorrowful writings offer about the very nature of human suffering and the search for justice in a collapsing world? The search for justice and the burden of the past asterisk as the first intermediate period unfolded. The literature of disillusionment did more than just describe the chaos. It wrestled with profound philosophical questions, primarily the nature of justice and the meaning of suffering. For you, the common Egyptian, these intellectual struggles, however abstract, reflected your own daily quest for meaning in a world where divine order, Ma'at, seemed to have vanished. These texts were not just laments, they were desperate attempts to understand why such suffering had befallen a land once blessed by the gods. The concept of divine justice was a central tenet of Old Kingdom belief. Good deeds were expected to be rewarded, and evil punished, often by the pharaoh who embodied justice. But in the first intermediate period, the reality was starkly different. The righteous suffered, the wicked often prospered, or at least survived, and the traditional order of society was inverted. The admonitions of Ipwe, for instance, repeatedly laments this inversion. He who possessed no property is now a man of means, and the son of a high-ranking man is a man of means no longer. This wasn't merely social commentary, it was a profound crisis of faith in the very principles that were supposed to govern the universe. Imagine witnessing the wealthy, once secure in their lavish tombs, now having their resting places plundered, as discussed in Story 9, or seeing former officials, once powerful and respected, now reduced to begging for food. This grim reality found its voice in these literary works, which questioned the very fabric of existence. If the gods were truly just, why did they permit such widespread misery? Was it divine punishment, or had the gods themselves abandoned Egypt? The dispute between a man and his bar soul delves even deeper into this existential crisis. The protagonist, disillusioned with life's injustice, yearns for death as a release from suffering. His bar attempts to dissuade him, not by promising a glorious afterlife as in Old Kingdom texts, but by painting a bleak picture of a forgotten burial and a futile existence in the realm of the dead. This dialogue highlights the internal conflict of individuals grappling with overwhelming despair, questioning the very value of life when faced with such profound hardship. It reflects a shift from an unquestioning acceptance of cosmic order to a deeply personal struggle with despair and the search for individual solace. Another significant piece from this era, or reflecting its ethos, is the teaching for King Merope. This text, purportedly written by a pharaoh of the Heracleopolitan dynasty, is a manual on kingship. While it offers practical advice on governance and military strategy, reflecting the realities of the time. It also contains passages that lament the breakdown of society and the difficulty of restoring order. Crucially, it reasserts the importance of Mat and the pharaoh's responsibility to uphold it, but now with a more pragmatic, less idealized tone. It acknowledges the challenges and failures of the past, implicitly referencing the very suffering that characterized the first intermediate period. This text shows a nascent attempt to find a new path forward, a way to rebuild stability by acknowledging the harsh lessons of the past. These literary works, though grim, were also a testament to the resilience of the Egyptian intellect, even when the material conditions for writing and scholarship were dire. The human need to express, to question, and to find meaning persisted. These were not works for a mass audience, but for a smaller, literate elite who shared similar experiences of disillusionment. The act of writing itself, painstakingly undertaken on scarce papyrus, became an act of defiance against the chaos, a way to preserve a record of their suffering and their spiritual struggle. The literature of the first intermediate period stands in stark contrast to the optimistic narratives that preceded it. It bears the heavy burden of the past, the memory of a unified, prosperous age that seemed irrevocably lost. It questions the divine compact, grapples with existential despair, and critiques a world where justice is a distant memory. These powerful, mournful voices offer a unique window into the psychological and spiritual landscape of a civilization on the brink, struggling to comprehend its own undoing. What profound impact would these expressions of disillusionment have on the future understanding of kingship, gods, and the very meaning of existence in a revitalized Egypt? The enduring legacy, a new understanding of humanity and divinity, asterisk. The wisdom of the disillusioned from the first intermediate period, born from the crucible of famine and chaos, left an indelible mark on Egyptian thought that would resonate for centuries. For you, the common Egyptian, these unflinching reflections on suffering and injustice, however raw, provided a framework for understanding your own experience and subtly shifted the cultural understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. These literary voices, though often sorrowful, were the seeds of a new, more resilient philosophical outlook that would define the Middle Kingdom. The most profound legacy of this literature was a deepening of human introspection. Old Kingdom texts often depicted an idealized world and an elite focused on their achievements and eternal rewards. The first intermediate period's writings, in contrast, grappled with existential despair, moral ambiguity, and the very meaning of life when faced with overwhelming suffering. Texts like The Dispute Between a Man and His Bar explored the inner turmoil of the individual, giving voice to doubts and anxieties that were rarely expressed in earlier, more confident eras. This shift towards a more personal and introspective view of humanity would become a hallmark of Middle Kingdom literature and thought. Furthermore, this period fostered a revaluation of the nature of divinity and kingship. The crisis of Mat, so vividly portrayed in texts like the Admonitions of Ippur, forced a questioning of the pharaoh's absolute divine power. If the living god-king could not prevent famine and chaos, then perhaps his role was not solely divine guarantor, but also a more practical, human one. The teaching for King Merikare, while still emphasizing the pharaoh's responsibility, couches it in terms of pragmatic governance, acknowledging the real-world challenges of ruling a fractured land. This laid the groundwork for the Middle Kingdom's emphasis on the pharaoh as a good shepherd of his people, a benevolent leader who actively ensured their welfare, rather than just a distant, unapproachable deity. The literature also provided a psychological release, a way for Egyptians to process the profound trauma they were enduring. By articulating the despair, the inversion of social order, and the sense of divine abandonment, these texts offered a shared understanding of the collective suffering. They validated the experiences of those who felt abandoned by the gods and betrayed by their rulers. For you, these words might have offered a strange comfort, a recognition that your own despair was not unique, but part of a larger, shared human condition. Crucially, the survival and later copying of these texts in the Middle Kingdom and beyond indicate their enduring impact. They served as a potent historical memory of the Dark Age, a cautionary tale for future rulers, and a reminder of the fragility of order. Future pharaohs and officials would likely have studied these texts, understanding the consequences of neglect and the importance of active governance. This direct engagement with the failures of the past helped shape the more robust and resilient state that emerged in the Middle Kingdom. The wisdom of the disillusioned was not just a collection of sorrowful writings. It was a profound intellectual adaptation to an unprecedented crisis. It stripped away idealized notions of divinity and society, forcing Egyptians to confront the stark realities of human vulnerability. In doing so, it paved the way for a more nuanced understanding of humanity's relationship with its gods, its rulers, and itself. The first intermediate period, for all its material hardship, fostered an intellectual and spiritual awakening that profoundly shaped the future of Egyptian civilization, laying the philosophical groundwork for a new golden age. The rise of the Middle Kingdom, a new golden age forged in crisis asterisk. The scars of the past and the promise of the future asterisk, as the long dark shadow of the first intermediate period finally began to recede. Egypt emerged from over a century of famine, fragmentation, and civil war. The reunification, hard won under the leadership of Mentuhotep II of Thebes, didn't erase the deep scars left by the chaos. The memory of a fragmented land, of empty granaries, of warring nomarchs, and of the gods seemingly abandoning their people, was burned into the collective consciousness. Yet, out of this profound crisis, a new and vibrant era was born. The Middle Kingdom. For you, the common Egyptian who had endured the preceding generations of hardship, this period wasn't just a return to stability. It was a pragmatic, resilient, and deeply self-aware golden age, forged directly from the lessons of the past. Imagine the Egypt that Mentuhotep II inherited. It was a land physically exhausted and psychologically traumatized. Vast stretches of agricultural land lay fallow, irrigation systems had fallen into disrepair, and trade routes were insecure. The once centralized bureaucracy had disintegrated, and the power of the nomarchs remained a potent, though now subordinate, force. The pharaoh's divine legitimacy, once absolute, had been profoundly questioned during the long years of suffering. This was not a blank slate, but a shattered mosaic that needed to be painstakingly reassembled. Mentuhotep II and his successors of the 11th and 12th dynasties understood that simply reverting to the old kingdom model wouldn't work. Couldn't ignore the trauma or pretend the decentralization hadn't happened. Instead, they consciously built a new state that incorporated the lessons learned from the chaos. This new approach was characterized by a blend of renewed centralization, a more pragmatic kingship, and a surprising emphasis on social justice and the well-being of the common person. A direct response to the famine and injustices of the first intermediate period, one of the first priorities was the re-establishment of order and infrastructure. Mentuhotep II and his successors focused on repairing the damaged irrigation systems, bringing fallow lands back into cultivation, and ensuring the efficient collection and storage of grain in royal granaries. For you, this meant the slow but steady return of a reliable food supply, the most basic and crucial step towards stability. The emphasis was on practical solutions, on making the Nile productive again through active governance, rather than simply relying on divine favor. The pharaoh's role also evolved. While still divine, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs presented themselves as more accessible, more concerned with the welfare of their subjects, and more active in governance than their Old Kingdom predecessors. They were often depicted as benevolent shepherds, tireless workers who personally oversaw the prosperity of the land. This shift in image was a direct response to the perceived failure of the Old Kingdom. Pharaohs to protect their people from famine and chaos. Texts from this era, like the prophecy of Nefertiti, though possibly composed earlier, widely known now, and the teaching for King Merikari, underscored the pharaoh's responsibility to maintain Mat through just rule and effective administration. The nomarchs, who had carved out their own power bases during the first intermediate period, were not eliminated. Instead, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs found ways to integrate them into the new centralized state. Their hereditary positions were often recognized, but their power was carefully managed through royal oversight, regular visits from royal officials, and the establishment of new, loyal administrative structures. This allowed the pharaoh to benefit from the nomarch's local knowledge and authority while ensuring their ultimate loyalty to the crown. It was a subtle, yet effective, form of power sharing designed to prevent another collapse into fragmentation. The capital remained at Thebes initially, symbolizing the new beginning and the source of reunification. However, later Middle Kingdom pharaohs, particularly of the 12th dynasty, would establish new administrative capitals like Itwi near modern Lisht in Middle Egypt. This strategic move allowed them to better control both Upper and Lower Egypt and to exert their authority over the northern Nomar, while still maintaining strong ties to Thebes as a spiritual and cultural heartland. The Middle Kingdom, therefore, was not merely a copy of the old. It was a conscious reconstruction built upon the painful lessons of its recent past. It fostered a new kind of kingship, a more resilient administration, and a deeper understanding of the fragility of order. For you, this meant the promise of a return to the Golden Age, but one that was more grounded, more pragmatic, and perhaps more human. What lasting intellectual and spiritual changes would this resilient new era bring about? And how would Egypt attempt to secure its stability against future threats? The literature of resilience and the democratized afterlife *, the Middle Kingdom's resurgence was not merely a political and economic revival. It was a profound cultural and intellectual renaissance, directly shaped by the bitter experiences of the first intermediate period. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant a world where your anxieties and hopes found new expression, and where the promise of eternity, once a royal prerogative, became surprisingly accessible. This era witnessed a blooming of literature that reflected a more complex, introspective, and ultimately resilient understanding of humanity and its place in a reordered cosmos. Imagine the powerful impact of a society reflecting on its own near demise. The literature of the Middle Kingdom, unlike the confident, often impersonal texts of the Old Kingdom, grappled with the trauma of the past. It built upon the wisdom of the disillusioned from the first intermediate period, but infused it with a newfound sense of hope and the pragmatic determination of a society that had survived its darkest hour. This is the era of the instructional literature, where a pharaoh or wise sage offers advice on proper conduct, often framed as lessons learned from times of chaos. Texts like the Loyalist teaching emphasized obedience to the new, strong pharaoh, promising stability and prosperity in return. These were not just moral platitudes. They were practical guides for rebuilding a fractured society. One of the most striking developments was the democratization of the afterlife. The Old Kingdom's emphasis on the pharaoh as the sole conduit to eternity had been shattered by the collapse of royal mortuary cults and the widespread tomb robbery as explored in Story 9. In the Middle Kingdom, this promise of eternal life became available to a wider segment of society. This is best exemplified by the proliferation of coffin texts. These collections of spells and incantations, once primarily restricted to royal pyramids, were now inscribed on the wooden coffins of wealthy and even middle-class individuals. For you, if you had enough resources, this meant that your own soul could traverse the dangers of the underworld and achieve a blessed existence, largely independent of the pharaoh's direct intervention. This reflected a profound shift towards individual piety and a more personal relationship with the divine. The art and sculpture of the Middle Kingdom also reflected this new pragmatism and introspection. Pharaohs were no longer always depicted as idealized, emotionless gods. Instead, their statues often showed a more human, even weary, expression, reflecting the burdens of kingship and the challenges of governing a recently reunified land. This subtle shift communicated a sense of shared experience, signaling to the populace that their ruler understood their struggles. The private tombs of nobles, while still depicting scenes of daily life and offerings, often showed a greater emphasis on personal piety and good deeds, aligning with the new focus on individual accountability. Furthermore, the Middle Kingdom saw a resurgence in scribal activity and the meticulous preservation of knowledge. The new centralized government understood that a strong bureaucracy, accurate records, and a literate class were essential for maintaining the stability that had been so painfully regained. Libraries were re-established, and ancient texts were painstakingly copied and preserved. This intellectual rebirth allowed for the transmission of Old Kingdom knowledge, while also fostering new literary and scientific developments. For you, this meant a gradual return to order in official dealings, a system of justice based on written law, and the revival of cultural traditions. The Middle Kingdom was a society that had looked into the abyss and pulled itself back. Its literature, art, and religious practices bore the indelible scars of the First Intermediate Period, but they also showcased an extraordinary capacity for resilience and adaptation. The wisdom of the disillusioned fostered a more realistic view of human nature, a more pragmatic understanding of kingship, and a more accessible path to eternity. This new golden age was not a return to innocence, but a testament to a civilization that had learned from its darkest hours and emerged stronger, wiser, and more intimately connected to its own humanity. What challenges would this robust new kingdom face, and how would its hard-won stability ultimately come to an end? The price of stability and the seeds of decline, the Middle Kingdom, born from the ashes of the First Intermediate Period, successfully re-established order and prosperity. But this stability came at a cost, and it contained the very seeds of its eventual decline. For you, the common Egyptian, this era represented a return to a more predictable life, but also a shift towards a more centralized, almost authoritarian, state that prioritized stability above all else. This new golden age, while glorious, ultimately succumbed to challenges that echoed the very problems it had overcome. Imagine the immense effort required to rebuild a shattered nation. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, driven by the trauma of the First Intermediate Period, implemented highly centralized control over the economy, the administration, and even the military. This involved extensive land reclamation projects in the Fayum oasis to increase agricultural output, the meticulous upkeep of irrigation systems, and strict management of grain storage. While this ensured food, security, and prosperity, it also meant a tighter grip from the central government. Your life, though more secure, was subject to more direct oversight and taxation. The relationship between the pharaoh and the powerful nomarchs, who had asserted their independence in the preceding era, was a delicate balance. While the pharaohs largely allowed them to retain their hereditary positions and local authority, they gradually undermined their power. New administrative districts were created. Royal officials were appointed to oversee provincial affairs, and the pharaohs established a system where local resources were funneled back to the central government. Over time, the nomarchs became more akin to provincial bureaucrats than independent rulers, their power waning as the pharaohs grew. This process, while preventing another fragmentation, also centralized too much power in the hands of the king, making the state vulnerable to a weak pharaoh later on. The Middle Kingdom also engaged in ambitious military campaigns and foreign policy. Unlike the Old Kingdom, which was largely isolated, the Middle Kingdom actively campaigned into Nubia to secure its gold mines and control trade routes. They built formidable fortresses in Nubia and maintained a standing army. While this brought wealth and protected Egypt's borders, it also meant a constant demand for resources and manpower, including conscription for you, the common person. The state's focus shifted from internal security alone to projecting power abroad. A necessary step for economic stability, but also a drain on resources. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom saw a continued flourishing of literature, art, and monumental architecture, though often with a more practical focus than the Old Kingdom. Temples were built, but perhaps more for utility than sheer scale. Literature became more introspective, reflecting the complex human experience forged in crisis. This intellectual vitality was a testament to the resilience of Egyptian culture. However, the very elements that brought stability to the Middle Kingdom also contained the seeds of its decline. The hypercentralization, while effective under strong pharaohs, could become a weakness if a weak or ineffectual ruler ascended the throne. The diminishing power of the nomarchs, while initially beneficial for unity, meant that when the central government inevitably weakened, there were fewer strong regional leaders to maintain local order. The reliance on foreign resources and continued military campaigns also made Egypt susceptible to external pressures and internal revolts if those campaigns failed. Ultimately, the Middle Kingdom, after centuries of renewed prosperity and stability, would face its own challenges. A combination of internal administrative weakening, potential environmental shifts, and the emergence of new, powerful foreign groups, particularly the Hyksos from the Near East, would gradually erode its power. The very stability that had been so carefully constructed would eventually give way, leading Egypt into another period of fragmentation and foreign domination, the Second Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom stands as a powerful testament to Egypt's enduring capacity for recovery and adaptation. It learned from the trauma of the First Intermediate Period, building a stronger, more pragmatic state that balanced central authority with regional realities. It cultivated a more introspective culture and democratized access to the afterlife. Yet, like all human endeavors, its achievements were ultimately impermanent. and its hard-won golden age would eventually give way, proving that even the most resilient of civilizations could not escape the cyclical nature of rise, fall, and rebirth. The Hyksos invasion, Egypt's first foreign overlords, and a nation divided again, the subtle infiltration and a kingdom's weakness, imagine being an Egyptian living in the thriving Middle Kingdom. A period of renewed stability and prosperity forged from the chaos of the first intermediate period. Your pharaoh, ruling from Itiche or Thebes, was strong. The Nile's floods were generally reliable, and the economy was booming. Egypt projected its power into Nubia and maintained trade relations across the Near East. Life felt orderly and secure, a stark contrast to the difficult times your grandparents spoke of. Yet, even in this age of confidence, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift was occurring in the northern reaches of the Delta, one that would ultimately lead to Egypt's second major collapse and its first experience of foreign rule. For you, the common Egyptian, this initial infiltration seemed innocuous. A gradual demographic change until it was too late. The seeds of a foreign takeover were being sown in your very own backyard. The invaders who would eventually dominate Egypt were known as the Hyksos, a Greek corruption of an Egyptian term, Hekakoset, meaning rulers of foreign lands. They were not a single ethnic group, but rather a diverse mix of peoples, primarily from the Near East, including Canaanites, Amorites, and Herbians. Their arrival in Egypt was not a sudden, dramatic invasion at first. Instead, it was a slow, steady infiltration over many decades, driven by a combination of factors: the attraction of Egypt's wealth, the lure of its fertile delta lands, and perhaps pressures from their own homelands. During the late Middle Kingdom, particularly under the weakening pharaohs of the 13th dynasty, the central government's grip on the eastern delta began to loosen. This region, bordering the Sinai and the Near East, had long been a corridor for trade and migration. As the pharaohs in Ichitai became less effective, or their administrative focus shifted, communities of these Near Eastern peoples began to settle in increasing numbers in the delta. They arrived as traders, craftsmen, laborers, and pastoralists, drawn by the agricultural opportunities that a strong Middle Kingdom had created. Many were likely welcomed initially, as they provided a workforce or contributed to local economies. These foreign settlers gradually established themselves, often forming their own communities alongside existing Egyptian towns. They brought with them their own cultural practices, their own languages, and crucially, their own technologies. Among these were superior bronze working techniques, composite bows, and most notably, the horse and chariot. The Egyptians, accustomed to their traditional infantry and simpler weaponry, had not yet widely adopted these military innovations. At this early stage, these were just foreign curiosities, perhaps seen in skirmishes on the borders, but not yet recognized as a fundamental threat over time. As the central authority continued to weaken and the 13th dynasty pharaohs struggled with internal dissent and short reigns, these foreign communities in the delta grew in size and influence. Their leaders, the future Hyksos rulers, began to exert control over their immediate surroundings. They built their own towns and eventually established their capital at Avaris, modern Tel El-Daba, in the northeastern delta. Avaris quickly became a major port city, a thriving hub of trade and cultural exchange, largely outside the effective control of the pharaoh in the south. For you, an Egyptian living in the delta, this growing foreign presence would have been a gradual, almost imperceptible shift. You might have seen more foreign faces, heard different languages, and observed unfamiliar customs. Perhaps your local nomarch, struggling to maintain order amidst the declining central power, began to deal directly with these powerful foreign leaders, granting them concessions or seeking their informal protection. The line between being a foreign settler and an independent ruler blurred, until these rulers of foreign lands essentially became the dominant power in the northern part of your country. The true danger of the Hyksos wasn't initially their military might, but Egypt's internal weakness. The centralized state of the Middle Kingdom, once its strength, had become too rigid and inflexible. The rapid succession of weak pharaohs in the 13th dynasty, combined with an over-reliance on a bureaucracy that was becoming less effective, left the northern frontier vulnerable. By the time the pharaohs in the south realized the extent of the Hyksos power, it was already too late to effectively expel them through conventional means. The infiltration had become an entrenched presence, setting the stage for a dramatic usurpation of power and the painful reality of a nation divided once more, with a foreign overlord in its heart. What would it mean for Egypt, a civilization so proud of its unique identity, to be ruled by foreigners? The Delta stronghold and the fall of ITJ-TAWY**. The gradual infiltration of the Hyksos into the eastern Delta eventually transitioned from a demographic shift to a direct challenge to Egyptian sovereignty. For you, the common Egyptian, this period brought a terrifying realization. The powerful Middle Kingdom you once knew was fracturing, and foreign invaders were no longer just distant traders, but active contenders for power, armed with technologies that would fundamentally change the nature of warfare in Egypt. Imagine the strategic advantage the Hyksos had meticulously built in the eastern delta. Their capital, Avaris, modern Tel El-Daba, grew into a formidable stronghold, a bustling metropolis with a large foreign population and a deep harbor connecting them to the maritime trade routes of the Near East. From this base, they didn't just settle, they asserted control. This wasn't a stealthy operation, it was a visible consolidation of power. Yet the weakening 13th dynasty pharaohs in Ichtwa, their capital in Middle Egypt, seemed unable or unwilling to effectively counter it. Their focus was often on internal struggles, a rapid succession of short-reigning kings, and the increasing insubordination of local officials, leaving the Delta vulnerable. Crucially, the Hyksos brought with them military innovations that would give them a decisive edge. The most significant of these was the horse and chariot. The Egyptians, for centuries, had relied on their infantry armed with spears, axes, and bows. The sight of chariots, light, two-wheeled platforms drawn by powerful horses, would have been terrifying and utterly alien. These fast-moving war machines allowed for rapid maneuvers on the battlefield, quick charges into enemy lines, and effective deployment of archers. Their soldiers also utilized superior composite bows made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, which had a greater range and striking power than the simple self-bows traditionally used by Egyptians. Furthermore, their bronze weaponry was generally more advanced, offering sharper blades and more durable armor. This technological gap was a game-changer. When the inevitable military confrontations occurred, the Egyptians, fighting with outdated tactics and equipment, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. These weren't necessarily massive, organized campaigns by the Hyksos across the whole of Egypt, but rather a series of escalating conflicts that gradually pushed the weakened Egyptian central authority further south. The Hyksos were less interested in direct conquest of all of Egypt initially. and more focused on securing their northern delta stronghold and expanding their influence through trade and tribute. For you, living in the Delta or Middle Egypt, the shift in power would have been palpable. Your local nomarch might have been forced to acknowledge Hyksos overlordship, sending tribute to Avaris instead of Ichtwi. You would have seen Hyksos soldiers mounted on chariots, patrolling your roads, enforcing their will, their culture. With different gods, names, and customs would become more prominent, though they often adopted Egyptian titles and even worshipped some Egyptian deities. A pragmatic move to legitimize their rule. The final blow to the Middle Kingdom's central authority came with the fall of which the details are unclear, but it seems that the Hyksos expansion southward from the Delta eventually led to the capture of the traditional royal capital. This wasn't necessarily a complete military occupation of all of Egypt, but it effectively dissolved the centralized Middle Kingdom state. The pharaonic line at Ichtwi either collapsed, fled, or was subjugated. With Ichtwi gone, Egypt was plunged into the Second Intermediate Period, a renewed era of fragmentation, but with a new, critical dimension: foreign rule. The Hyksos established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling directly from Avaris. Their control extended over Lower Egypt, the Delta, and much of Middle Egypt, where they exacted tribute from local Egyptian princes. Further south, a weakened but independent Egyptian dynasty, the 17th dynasty, emerged in Thebes, clinging to the traditions of the unified past and dreaming of expelling the foreign invaders. Egypt, the proud land of the pharaohs, was now tragically divided. The Delta and much of Middle Egypt were under the sway of foreign overlords, while a smaller, weaker Egyptian state struggled to survive in the south. The Hyksos invasion was a profound shock, a stark reminder that even a resilient civilization could fall when internal weakness met external innovation. What would it mean for the Egyptians to live under a foreign yoke, and how would they eventually muster the strength to reclaim their land? Living under foreign rule and the seeds of reconquest *, the establishment of the Hyksos 15th dynasty in Avaris marked a grim new reality for Egypt, its first widespread foreign rule. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant a life fundamentally altered by the presence of overlords who spoke a different language, worshipped different gods, and held a very different understanding of kingship. Yet, this period of subjugation, painful as it was, also ignited a fierce spirit of resistance and planted the seeds for the glorious reconquest that would usher in Egypt's greatest era. Imagine living in a land where the pharaoh, once the undisputed embodiment of cosmic order, was either a foreign king or a distant, powerless shadow in the south. The Hyksos rulers at Avaris adopted many Egyptian titles and customs, even worshipping some Egyptian deities like Seth, whom they equated with their own storm god, Bol. This was a pragmatic move to legitimize their rule in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects. However, their court at Avaris was culturally distinct, a vibrant mix of Egyptian and Near Eastern elements, characterized by different architectural styles and burial practices. You might have seen their unique chariots and composite bows, not just as military tools, but as symbols of their foreign dominance. For the ordinary Egyptian in the northern territories, living under Hyksos rule was a complex experience. While there were undoubtedly periods of oppression and exploitation, particularly in the early stages of their rule, the Hyksos also brought a degree of stability and re-established trade networks with the Near East, bringing new goods and ideas into Egypt. Avaris became a thriving international port. Some Egyptians undoubtedly integrated into Hyksos society, serving as scribes, craftsmen, or even officials within their administration. However, for many, the underlying resentment of foreign domination would have simmered, a constant reminder of their lost sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Upper Egypt, a new line of Egyptian pharaohs arose from Thebes, forming the 17th dynasty. These were the true inheritors of the unified Egyptian spirit, maintaining the traditional cults, rituals, and language that distinguished them from their Hyksos overlords. Their power was limited, largely confined to the region between Elef in the south and Abydos in the north, but their existence was a powerful symbol of Egyptian resistance. They initially coexisted with the Hyksos, likely paying tribute and avoiding direct confrontation, focusing on rebuilding their own regional power. However, this uneasy truce was bound to break. The very presence of foreign rulers in the sacred land of Egypt was an affront to the deep-seated national identity. The Theban pharaohs, driven by a fierce desire for reconquest and liberation, began to prepare for the inevitable war. They secretly adopted and adapted the very military technologies that had given the Hyksos their advantage: the horse and chariot and the composite bow. They trained their armies, built up their resources, and nurtured a powerful sense of nationalistic fervor among their people. The conflict that followed would be long and brutal. It began with the Theban king Psychonin Tau II, who famously engaged in skirmishes with the Hyksos, and whose mummified remains show severe battle wounds, suggesting he died fighting them. The torch of liberation was then passed to his son, Khama, who launched a more aggressive campaign, pushing northward and even attacking Avaris. His Steliad Karnak proudly record his victories and his determination to drive out the Asians. The ultimate triumph came with Amos I, Kamosi's younger brother. Amos, through a sustained and determined military effort, finally expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, pursuing them into Canaan and effectively ending their dominion around 1550 BCE. This momentous victory marked the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the glorious beginning of the New Kingdom, a golden age of imperial expansion and unprecedented wealth. The Hyksos invasion, though a period of humiliation and division, ultimately served as a profound crucible for Egyptian identity. It forced Egypt to adapt military technologies, fostering a more outward-looking and militaristic mindset. More importantly, it solidified a fierce sense of national unity born from shared adversity. The experience of foreign rule instilled a powerful determination to prevent future invasions, leading to the creation of an empire that would stretch far beyond Egypt's traditional borders. The scars of the Hyksos occupation ran deep, but from them blossomed the ambition and resilience that would define Egypt's most powerful era, the birth of the New Kingdom, from liberation to empire asterisk. The fury of Thebes and the drive to expel asterisk. Imagine being an Egyptian during the desperate days of the Second Intermediate Period, living under the oppressive shadow of foreign rule. Your land, once unified and glorious, was now split, with the Hyksos controlling the fertile delta and much of Middle Egypt from their capital, Avaris. While some Egyptians might have adapted to life under their foreign overlords, a fierce, burning resentment simmered in the south, particularly in Thebes. Here, a lineage of Egyptian pharaohs, the 17th dynasty, clung to the last vestiges of true Egyptian sovereignty, nurturing a singular, burning ambition to drive out the invaders and reclaim their shattered nation. For you, the common Egyptian in the south, this was more than just a political struggle. It was a crusade for the very soul of Egypt, a war of liberation that would ultimately forge its greatest empire. The Theban pharaohs of the 17th dynasty understood that coexistence with the Hyksos was unsustainable. Their initial strategy had been one of quiet consolidation, strengthening their hold over Upper Egypt, securing trade routes to Nubia, and patiently building their resources. But the cultural and ideological divide was too vast. The Hyksos, despite adopting some Egyptian customs, were still seen as alien occupiers, an affront to Mat and the sacred traditions of the land. The insults and demands from avarice, such as the famous tale of the Hyksos king Apophis complaining about the hippos in Thebes disturbing his sleep, were thinly veiled provocations that fueled the simmering rage in the south. The true architects of the reconquest, and thus the new kingdom, were a succession of Theban warrior kings. The first spark of open defiance came from Sekenin Dautu. His reign saw direct military clashes with the Hyksos, and his mummified remains, found with horrific head wounds consistent with Hyksos weaponry, suggest he died bravely on the battlefield. A martyr for Egyptian independence, his sacrifice became a powerful symbol, galvanizing the Theban cause and demonstrating the very real cost of liberation. For you, the death of your king in battle would have been a profoundly sobering, yet unifying event, cementing the resolve to fight. The mantle of leadership then passed to Sekenon's son, Kamamos. Unlike his father, Kamos launched a more aggressive, determined campaign to push the Hyksos out. His famous victory, Stele at Karnak, articulate a clear, nationalistic ideology. He declared his intention to confront the Asiatics in Avaris, stating, "I should like to know what my might is when one chief is in Avaris and another in Kush, and I sit united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man holding his slice of this Egypt." This wasn't just about territorial gains. It was about reclaiming the very essence of Egypt, restoring its unified identity. Kamosi's campaigns were strategically brilliant. He pushed northward, liberating key cities in Middle Egypt, attacking Hyksos strongholds, and disrupting their communication and supply lines. He even reached the vicinity of Avaris itself, though he did not capture the city. His campaigns were marked by a new ferocity and tactical awareness, adapting the very military innovations that had given the Hyksos an advantage. The Thebans, through direct observation and perhaps even defection, had learned to master the horse and chariot and the superior composite bow. This adoption of enemy technology would prove crucial in turning the tide of the war. The drive to expel the Hyksos was not just a military effort, it was a deeply ingrained cultural imperative. The foreign presence was seen as a profound disorder, a disruption of the divine balance. The Theban pharaohs skillfully leveraged this nationalistic sentiment, uniting a fragmented people behind a common enemy. Temples, though still suffering from the Second Intermediate Period's turmoil, would have become centers for patriotic fervor, emphasizing the need to purify the land and restore the rightful divine order. For you, participating in this liberation war would have been a brutal, yet perhaps empowering, experience. You might have been conscripted into the rapidly growing Theban army, learning to wield new weapons and fight alongside disciplined troops. The journey north, fighting for every inch of sacred Egyptian soil, would have instilled a profound sense of purpose and national identity, rekindling the pride in a heritage that had been suppressed for generations. The ultimate goal was clear: to drive the invaders back across the desert and restore Egypt's true kings to their rightful place. What decisive actions would finally drive the Hyksos from Egypt, and how would this triumph reshape the very nature of Egyptian power? The final push and the new military might *, the fierce nationalistic fervor ignited by Seqonen-Adao II and fanned by Kamose, finally reached its crescendo under the leadership of Ahmose for you, the common Egyptian who had endured generations of foreign rule and civil strife. Ahmose was the ultimate liberator, the king who would transform the desperate fight for survival into a resounding triumph. His reign marked not just the expulsion of the Hyksos, but the birth of a new, more powerful and ultimately imperial Egypt. Imagine the relentless campaigns that Ahmose launched. Building on the foundations laid by his predecessors, he systematically pushed northward, freeing one town and city after another from Hyksos control. His forces were not just motivated by patriotism, they were now equipped with, and expertly, trained in the very military innovations that had once given the Hyksos their advantage. The horse and chariot, once a symbol of foreign oppression, became a formidable weapon in Egyptian hands. The composite bow, with its superior range and power, was now wielded by disciplined Egyptian archers. This rapid adaptation of enemy technology was crucial to Ahmose's success, demonstrating a new pragmatism and adaptability in Egyptian warfare. The climactic moment came with the siege of Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the eastern delta. This was no quick skirmish, but a prolonged, brutal struggle. Archaeological evidence suggests that Avaris was a formidable city, well fortified and defended. Ahmose's forces would have had to employ sophisticated siege tactics, cutting off supplies, launching direct assaults, and slowly grinding down the Hyksos resistance. For you, participating in or hearing about this siege would have been a testament to the immense effort and sacrifice required for freedom. The fall of Avaris around the 11th year of Ahmose's reign c. 1550 BCE marked the true end of Hyksos dominion in Egypt. But Ahmose's ambition didn't stop at the borders of Egypt. He understood that simply expelling the Hyksos wasn't enough. To prevent future invasions, he had to neutralize their power base. He pursued them into southern Canaan, laying siege to the city of Sharon for 3 years. This campaign, far beyond Egypt's traditional frontiers, was a monumental undertaking, and a clear declaration of a new strategic doctrine. Egypt would now project its power outward to protect its borders, rather than passively waiting for threats to arrive. This aggressive foreign policy would become a defining characteristic of the new kingdom simultaneously. Ahmose also campaigned southward into Nubia. The Hyksos had indirectly benefited from alliances with Nubian rulers, and the southern regions also contained vital gold mines. Ahmose's Nubian campaigns re-established Egyptian control over these resources, securing the southern flank and ensuring a steady flow of wealth into the newly unified kingdom. This dual expansion, north into the Near East and south into Nubia, laid the territorial foundations for the vast empire of the new kingdom. The sheer scale of these military victories fundamentally reshaped Egyptian society. The army, once a regional force, became a powerful national institution. Military service became a path to upward mobility, and the pharaoh, now a victorious warrior king, commanded unprecedented loyalty and respect. The focus on military prowess, advanced weaponry, and strategic expansion marked a clear departure from the more internally focused Middle Kingdom. For you, the common Egyptian, the triumph of Ahmose was nothing short of miraculous. It symbolized the restoration of Mat, the return of the true pharaoh to his rightful place, and the purification of the sacred land from foreign influence. The long nightmare of division and foreign rule was over. The Nile Valley was unified, its borders secured, and its resources flowing back to a centralized power. This hard-won liberation wasn't just a political change, it was a psychological turning point, igniting a national pride and confidence that would fuel Egypt's greatest imperial ambitions. What would this newfound power mean for Egypt's relationship with the rest of the world, and how would this era of triumph shape its culture and society? The imperial mindset and a new golden age asterisk. The complete expulsion of the Hyksos and the relentless campaigns of Amos I irrevocably transformed Egypt from a unified kingdom into a nascent empire. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant stepping into an era of unprecedented confidence, wealth, and international engagement. The trauma of foreign occupation had forged a powerful new mindset. Egypt would no longer wait for invaders. It would aggressively project its power outward to secure its borders and prevent future threats. This was the true dawn of the new kingdom. A golden age of imperial expansion, monumental construction, and cultural flourishing. Imagine the sheer psychological shift. For generations, Egypt had been preoccupied with internal stability or defending its borders. Now, under the triumphant 18th dynasty, it was the aggressor, a dominant force on the world stage. The concept of a buffer zone became paramount. Rather than simply maintaining its traditional borders, Egypt sought to control territories beyond them, creating a protective sphere of influence. This meant continuous military campaigns into Nubia, to the south and Levant, Canaan, and Syria. To the northeast, the control of Nubia was particularly vital. Its gold mines poured immense wealth into the Egyptian treasury, fueling the state's ambitious building projects and military machine. The new kingdom pharaohs established a systematic administration over Nubia, integrating it more fully into the Egyptian empire than ever before. For you, this meant an influx of new goods, but also the potential for military service in distant lands, in the Levant. Egyptian influence was exerted through both military might and diplomatic alliances. Pharaohs like Thutmose I, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep II led numerous campaigns, extending Egyptian control or influence deep into the Near East. Reaching as far as the Euphrates River, they established garrisons, collected tribute from vassal states, and engaged in complex diplomatic relations with other major powers of the time, such as Mitanni, the Hittites, and Babylon. This made Egypt a truly international power. A leader in the ancient world, the wealth generated by this imperial expansion was immense. Gold, silver, copper, exotic woods, incense, and vast quantities of raw materials flowed into Egypt, enriching the crown, the temples, and even the general populace. This newfound prosperity funded an explosion of monumental architecture on an unprecedented scale. Thebes, as the capital of the unifying dynasty, became a city of unparalleled splendor. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor, dedicated to Ammon, the patron god of Thebes, grew into colossal complexes, continually expanded by successive pharaohs. The Valley of the Kings, the secluded burial ground for the pharaohs of this era, reflects the immense resources dedicated to securing eternal life for the rulers. The army became a central institution of the new kingdom. It was highly organized, well-trained, and equipped with the latest military technology. Military service offered opportunities for social mobility and the chance to acquire wealth through plunder or official rewards. The pharaoh, often depicted as a heroic warrior, personally led his troops into battle, embodying the new assertive spirit of the age. Culturally, the New Kingdom was a vibrant period of innovation and synthesis. Egyptian art reached new heights of sophistication and realism, incorporating influences from the broader Near East. Religious thought expanded, with Amun becoming a national, almost universal, deity. Scribes and intellectuals flourished, producing a vast body of literature, including historical annals of military campaigns, elaborate tomb biographies, and complex religious texts. For you, the common Egyptian, this era offered a sense of national pride and security. While life remained challenging, the fear of foreign invasion had receded, replaced by the confidence of a powerful empire. The hard-won peace and prosperity were directly linked to the pharaoh's military successes and the efficient exploitation of imperial resources. The birth of the new kingdom was not just a historical event. It was a testament to Egypt's ability to learn from its deepest trauma, transforming a painful liberation into a defining age of unparalleled power and glory, cementing its place as a dominant force in the ancient world. The pharaohs of empire, power, piety, and personalities of the new kingdom * the warrior pharaohs, securing an empire by the sword * imagine stepping into the new kingdom, an era of unprecedented might and ambition for ancient Egypt. The chaotic years of the first intermediate period and the humiliating foreign rule of the Hyksos were a distant, yet ever-present, memory. This was a time when the pharaoh was no longer just a divine king or a benevolent shepherd, but a warrior pharaoh, personally leading his armies into battle, projecting Egyptian power far beyond the Nile Valley. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant an age of national pride, immense wealth flowing into the land, but also the constant possibility of conscription into a massive, professional army. This was an empire forged and maintained by the sword, a direct response to the vulnerability of the past. The true architects of this imperial transformation were the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, particularly Thutmose I, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep II. They understood that the only way to prevent future invasions was to create a buffer zone around Egypt, dominating its neighbors and securing crucial resources. This aggressive foreign policy fundamentally reshaped Egypt's relationship with the outside world. Thutmose I set the stage, leading campaigns deep into Nubia to the south and making the first recorded Egyptian push as far as the Euphrates River. In the Near East, his exploits were daring, establishing Egyptian control over the rich gold mines of Nubia and signaling Egypt's new intent to its northern neighbors. For you, this meant hearing tales of distant victories, seeing the influx of exotic goods, and perhaps, for the first time, realizing the vastness of the world beyond the Nile. But the undisputed Napoleon of Egypt was Thutmose III. After patiently awaiting his moment during the regency of his formidable stepmother Hatshepsut, he launched a series of relentless military campaigns, at least 17 over 2 decades, that systematically established Egypt's vast empire in the Levant and Syria. His initial, most famous victory was at the Battle of Megiddo, where he outmaneuvered a coalition of Canaanite princes and secured control over a vital trade route. Imagine the scale of logistics required, moving thousands of soldiers, chariots, and supplies across deserts through foreign lands. For you, the common foot soldier, these campaigns were arduous, fraught with danger, but also offered the tantalizing possibility of plunder and glory. Thutmose III's strategy was not just about brute force. He meticulously organized his conquests, establishing garrisons in conquered cities, appointing loyal Egyptian governors, and even bringing the children of conquered rulers back to Egypt for education, ensuring their loyalty when they eventually returned to rule their homelands. He maintained vast tribute lists, ensuring a steady flow of resources: gold, silver, copper, timber, chariots, and even exotic animals into Egypt. This systematic exploitation of foreign lands made Egypt incredibly wealthy. The Egyptian army itself underwent a massive transformation. It became a highly organized, professional force, complete with specialized divisions, infantry, archers, chariotry, and a clear command structure. Military service became a respected profession, offering opportunities for social mobility and career advancement. Soldiers were well trained and equipped with the latest weaponry, including the horse and chariot, now fully integrated into Egyptian military doctrine. The pharaoh himself was often depicted in art leading his troops, a dynamic image of a powerful warrior king who commanded both divine and military authority. The wealth from the empire fueled an unprecedented building boom, particularly in Thebes, the capital of the conquering dynasty. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor, dedicated to Amun-Re, the patron god of the victorious pharaohs, grew to colossal proportions, covered with detailed reliefs celebrating the pharaoh's military triumphs and the tribute brought from conquered lands. For you, the sight of these towering monuments and the lavish processions of foreign tribute would have been a constant, awe-inspiring display of Egypt's unparalleled power. The warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom learned the bitter lessons of the Hyksos invasion. They understood that security meant projection of power, and that a strong, active military was the ultimate guarantor of stability and prosperity. This imperial mindset, born from the crucible of foreign occupation, would define Egypt's greatest era, but it also placed immense demands on its rulers and its people. What personal characteristics defined these powerful pharaohs, and how did their piety shape their rule? Piety, personalities, and the power of the temple's asterisk beyond their military prowess. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were complex figures whose reigns were defined by a blend of immense personal power, profound piety, and distinct individual personalities. For you, the common Egyptian, the pharaoh was not just a distant warrior. He was the focal point of your spiritual and civic life, a living link to the gods, and the ultimate patron of the majestic temples that now dominated the landscape. This era saw an unprecedented fusion of royal authority and religious devotion, elevating both the king and the state's most powerful deity, Amun-Re. Imagine the profound religious significance of the pharaoh. In the New Kingdom, the king's role as the intermediary between humanity and the gods was more vital than ever. He was the chief priest of every cult, the one who performed the daily rituals to ensure the gods' favor and the continued prosperity of Egypt. This personal piety was not just for show. It was genuinely believed to be crucial for maintaining Mat, the cosmic order that had been so violently disrupted during the First Intermediate Period and the Hyksos occupation. The pharaoh's success in battle and the empire's wealth were seen as direct evidence of the gods' blessings, particularly those of Amun-Re. The wealth flowing from the empire was not just for the royal treasury or the army. A significant portion was dedicated to the gods, especially the powerful priesthood of Amun at Karnak and Luxor. These temple complexes grew into colossal economic and political entities, holding vast estates, numerous workshops, and employing thousands of priests, scribes, and laborers. The pharaohs endowed these temples with riches, commissioned grand expansions, and ensured that the cults ran flawlessly. For you, the sight of the towering pylons, the intricate reliefs, and the sheer scale of the Karnak complex would have been awe-inspiring, a physical manifestation of divine power and royal piety. The pharaoh's devotion to Amun-Re was both genuine belief and a shrewd political move. aligning the crown with the most influential religious institution in the land. Beyond their shared devotion to Amun-Re, these pharaohs possessed distinct personalities that shaped their reigns. Hatshepsut, a powerful female pharaoh, broke conventions. While her military campaigns were significant, her reign is most famous for her monumental building projects, like her exquisite mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari and her ambitious trade expedition to the distant land of Punt. She often depicted herself with masculine attributes, including a false beard to assert her kingly authority, showcasing a unique blend of personal ambition and traditional symbolism. For you, Hatshepsut would have been a fascinating and perhaps bewildering figure, a woman wielding the absolute power of a king. Amenhotep III, one of the wealthiest pharaohs in history, reigned during a period of immense prosperity and relative peace, often referred to as the Golden Age of the New Kingdom. He reveled in luxury, diplomacy, and monumental art. His colossal statues and grand palaces, like Malkata, showcased an empire at its zenith. He communicated extensively with other Near Eastern rulers through the Amarna letters, a trove of diplomatic correspondence that reveals a sophisticated international political landscape. His focus was less on conquest and more on consolidation and display of power through wealth and artistic patronage. Thutmose IV and Amenhotep II, while powerful warriors, also demonstrated the challenges of kingship. Thutmose IV claimed the throne by divine intervention, sleeping between the paws of the Great Sphinx and receiving a dream promise of kingship if he cleared the sand from around it. Amenhotep II was a renowned athlete and horseman, reflecting a new emphasis on personal prowess alongside divine right. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were not just interchangeable figures, they were dynamic individuals whose unique traits, coupled with their immense power and deep piety, shaped the direction of a sprawling empire. Their personal devotion to the gods was intertwined with the state's prosperity, and their monumental legacies were testaments to both their earthly authority and their eternal aspirations. This blend of strong personalities, vast wealth, and profound religious conviction created a golden age that projected Egyptian power and culture across the ancient world. But how would the immense power concentrated in the pharaoh and the temples ultimately lead to new challenges and internal strife? The burdens of empire and the seeds of discontent *, the immense power and prosperity of the New Kingdom pharaohs, while creating a golden age, also sowed the seeds of future challenges and internal strife. For you, the common Egyptian, the glory of empire brought opportunities, but also new burdens. As the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the pharaoh and the burgeoning temple complexes, particularly that of Amun-Re, began to create imbalances that would eventually lead to discontent and crisis. Imagine the sheer scale of the empire's demands. While the flow of tribute from conquered lands brought unprecedented wealth to Egypt, it also required constant vigilance and military campaigns, maintaining garrisons in distant Nubia and the Levant, suppressing revolts, and engaging in complex diplomatic and military rivalries with other great powers like the Hittites and Mitanni placed immense pressure on the state. For you, this meant the continued possibility of military conscription, lengthy absences from your home and fields, and the dangers of fighting in foreign lands. The warrior, pharaoh, while a source of pride, was also a relentless taskmaster. A significant shift occurred in the balance of power within Egypt itself. The immense wealth lavished upon the temples, especially the cult of Amun-Re at Karnak and Luxor, gradually led to the rise of an incredibly powerful priesthood. the high priests of Ammon became immensely influential figures, controlling vast estates, numerous employees, and a substantial portion of the nation's wealth. While the pharaohs initially used this to legitimize their rule and solidify their connection to the divine, over time, the power of the Ammon priesthood began to rival that of the pharaoh himself. This created an internal tension, a competition for resources and authority that would simmer beneath the surface throughout much of the new kingdom. The very success of the empire also brought new cultural and social complexities. Contact with foreign lands led to an influx of new ideas, gods, and peoples into Egypt. While this enriched Egyptian culture, it also challenged traditional norms and identities. Foreign deities gained some popularity, and Egyptian society became more diverse. While generally beneficial, this could also lead to internal tensions as different groups navigated their place within the empire. Furthermore, the concentration of wealth in the hands of the pharaoh, the nobility, and the great temples meant that while Egypt as a whole was prosperous, the benefits were not always evenly distributed. While there were opportunities for advancement through military service or the bureaucracy, the vast majority of the population remained humble farmers whose labor continued to support the grand imperial projects. The occasional periods of inflation or economic instability could hit the common people hard. Even in an age of overall plenty, the later pharaohs of the New Kingdom, particularly in the 19th and 20th dynasties, would inherit these growing burdens. The constant military engagements would become more defensive, expensive, and less consistently victorious. The power of the Ammon priesthood would continue to grow, challenging royal authority. Internal unrest, corruption, and economic strains would gradually chip away at the empire's foundations. The New Kingdom, for all its unparalleled might and splendor, was a testament to the cyclical nature of power. Forged in the crucible of foreign invasion, it rose to unprecedented heights by aggressively asserting its power and consolidating its resources. However, the very mechanisms that brought it glory, a powerful military, vast wealth, and a dominant priesthood, also contained the inherent risks of overextension, internal power struggles, and the concentration of resources. The pharaohs of empire built an awe-inspiring civilization, but they also laid the groundwork for the decline that would eventually usher in another period of fragmentation and change.